What if I told you that the very first great civilization in the Americas, the one that laid the groundwork for the Maya and the Aztecs, didn't just vanish without a trace, but left behind clues so bizarre, so profoundly strange, that for centuries we've just ignored them? We talk about their giant stone heads. They're famous. You've probably seen them in documentaries, maybe on a History Channel at 2 a.m. when you couldn't sleep. But the heads aren't the real story. They're the cover story. The real truth is hidden in what they worshipped, what they played, and the one thing they might have invented that you probably use today in your candy bar. Picture this. You're standing in a steamy jungle 3,000 years ago. The air is so thick you can practically chew it. Somewhere in the distance, a howler monkey screams like the world is ending. And buried beneath your feet, waiting in the mud, is a secret that will make you question everything you thought you knew about ancient America. Alright folks, what's happening? Welcome back to the channel. I'm your host, and tonight we're going deep. Real deep. Grab your favorite blanket, dim those lights, maybe pour yourself something that isn't made of fermented maize and chili peppers. You'll see why that's relevant later, trust me. Tonight we're doing something different. We're not just skimming the surface of history like it's Wikipedia at midnight. We're going past the glossy pages of your high school textbook and straight into the humid, mosquito-infested, jaguar-haunted heartland of the Olmecs. We're not just talking dates and names. We're talking about the unvarnished truth, the nitty-gritty, the stuff that makes you go, wait, they did what? You know how sometimes you watch a movie and think, there's no way people actually lived like this? Well, buckle up because we're about to explore a civilization that makes Game of Thrones look like a children's tea party. These people moved 50-ton stones through swampland without wheels. They played a sport where losing meant literally losing your head. They worshipped gods that were half human, half jaguar, and they did it all while living in a place that was basically trying to kill them 24/7. But here's the thing that really gets me. For decades, centuries even, we've been looking at their legacy all wrong. We see the giant heads and think, wow, impressive stone carving. But we miss the forest for the trees. We miss the blood rituals, the cosmic ball games, the shamans who believed they could shapeshift into jaguars, and the fact that they basically invented half the things that made later civilizations great. So if you dig this kind of long-form, late-night history that peels back the layers and shows you the stuff they don't teach in school, do me a solid and hit that subscribe button. It's free, it helps the channel grow, and it tells the all-powerful algorithm that we're a tribe of people who actually want to know what happened, not just the sanitized version. And hey, only if you're really into the deep dives, tap that notification bell, because we're going to be exploring more of these forgotten civilizations, these lost worlds that were stranger and more complex than anything Hollywood could dream up. Down in the comments, let me know right now. What's the one thing you think you know about the Olmecs? I bet it's the heads, right? Those massive stone faces staring out from the jungle. Well, stick around because we'll get there. Oh boy, will we get there. But those heads are just the appetizer. The main course is so much weirder. While you're thinking about that, hit me with your best guess. How do you think they moved those heads? Remember, no wheels, no horses, no modern machinery. Just human ingenuity and probably a lot of cursing in languages we'll never understand. Alright, settle in and get comfortable. We need to go back, way back, before Rome was even a collection of mud huts, before the Parthenon was even a blueprint in some Greek architect's head. We're going back 3,000 years to a place that was basically the primordial soup of Mesoamerican culture. Imagine the scene. The year is 1500 BCE. The Mediterranean is dominated by Mycenaean Greeks who think they're pretty hot stuff with their bronze weapons. The Egyptians are building their new kingdom, confident they're the center of the universe. And halfway around the world, in a place Europeans won't even know exists, for another 3 millennia, something extraordinary is happening. Picture the air thick and wet, heavy with the smell of mud and blooming orchids. The canopy above is so dense that even at midday the light filters down like you're underwater. The only sounds are the constant buzz of insects that want to drink your blood, the distant splash of something large moving through the river, and every now and then the bone-chilling roar of a jaguar announcing that this is its territory and you're just visiting. You are in the land of the people of the rubber, the Olmecs, and you've just stumbled upon something in the jungle, something that shouldn't exist, something huge and impossible and staring at you with stone eyes that have seen things you can't even imagine. But to understand what you're looking at, to really get why this matters, we need to start at the beginning. Not the beginning of the Olmecs, but the beginning of their rediscovery. Because sometimes the story of how we find history is just as wild as the history itself. Picture this. It's 1862. Mexico is in the middle of a civil war, and a guy named Jose Melgar is just trying to clear some land to plant crops. He's not thinking about archaeology or ancient civilizations. He's thinking about feeding his family. His machete hits something that definitely isn't a tree root. What happens next will change everything we think we know about the ancient Americas, and it all starts with one simple question. What do you do when you accidentally dig up a face the size of a small car? You're not an archaeologist. You don't even know what an archaeologist is. It's 1862, and you're Jose Melgar, a farmer in the Mexican state of Veracruz, trying to make a living in a country that can't seem to stop fighting itself. The French are invading. There's a civil war raging, and you're just trying to clear enough land to plant some corn and maybe feed your family. Your machete is getting dull from all the chopping, and the humidity is making your shirt stick to your back like a second skin. The mosquitoes are treating you like an all-you-can-eat buffet, and you're starting to wonder if this particular patch of jungle is worth the trouble. Then your blade hits something that definitely isn't a tree root. The sound is wrong. It's not the soft thunk of wood or the scrape of stone. It's something else entirely. Something that makes your arms vibrate and your teeth ache. You clear away some of the vines and dirt, and there's definitely something hard down there. Something big. So you dig, and you dig, and you dig some more. What emerges from the earth over the next few hours is going to give you nightmares for the rest of your life. Not because it's scary exactly, but because it's impossible. Slowly, painstakingly, a face reveals itself. But it's not just any face. It's colossal. The lips are thick and curved in what might be a slight smile or might be a grimace. The nose is broad and flared. The eyes are almond-shaped and seem to be staring into an eternity you can't even begin to comprehend. This isn't a statue in the sense that you might understand the word. This is a portrait carved from a single piece of stone that weighs more than your house. The detail is extraordinary. You can see the individual features with perfect clarity. This was someone's face, someone who lived and breathed and probably had opinions about the weather and what to have for dinner. But who carves a portrait this size? And why and how in the name of all the saints did they get it here in the middle of nowhere, buried under decades of jungle growth? You've just pulled the pin on a historical grenade, Jose. You have no idea what you found, but you've just uncovered the first piece of evidence for the oldest major civilization in the Americas. Now here's where the story gets frustrating in a way that makes you want to reach back through time and shake people by the shoulders. Jose Melgar, being a reasonable person, figures this is kind of a big deal. He contacts the authorities, writes letters, tries to get anyone to pay attention to what he's found. The response is, well, imagine discovering Mount Rushmore in your backyard and having the world just kind of shrug for half a century. That's essentially what happened. The few scholars who bothered to look at Melgar's discovery were baffled. This didn't fit into any of their neat little categories about ancient America. The established wisdom was that the Americas were populated by primitive peoples who couldn't possibly have created sophisticated art or complex civilizations. The Spanish conquistadors had already documented the Aztecs and the Maya, sure, but they were considered anomalies, flash-in-the-pan cultures that had somehow managed to stumble into greatness. But this head was different. It was older, for one thing. Much older. And it was, how to put this delicately, it didn't look like what people expected ancient Americans to look like. The features were broad, the nose was wide, the lips were full. To many 19th century observers, these characteristics suggested African origins, and since the prevailing wisdom was that indigenous Americans couldn't have created such sophisticated art, the logical conclusion was that this must be evidence of ancient African contact with the Americas. It was like posting a truly mind-blowing photo on Instagram and getting 3 likes and a comment from your mom asking if you're eating enough vegetables. The world just wasn't ready to deal with the implications of what Jose Melgar had found. For the next 60 years, that giant head sat in the jungle slowly being reclaimed by the vegetation while the world went about its business. The American Civil War ended, the Industrial Revolution picked up steam, World War I came and went, and still nobody seemed particularly interested in the fact that there was a massive stone portrait of an unknown ruler sitting in the Mexican countryside. It wasn't until the 1920s that serious archaeological attention finally turned to the site. And when it did, the discoveries that followed would completely rewrite our understanding of ancient America. But let's pause here for a moment and think about what Jose Melgar experienced that day in 1862. You're clearing land, probably thinking about dinner and whether it's going to rain, and suddenly you're face to face with a work of art that took months to create, carved by people who lived and died 1,000 years before Christ was born. The stone they used wasn't local. It came from mountains more than 60 miles away. Somebody had to quarry this massive block, transport it across rivers and swamps and jungle, and then spend hundreds of hours carefully carving every detail of this person's face. The ears are perfect. The expression is subtle and complex. This wasn't just a monument, it was a masterpiece. And it was just sitting there waiting for someone to literally stumble across it. Once you start thinking about the logistics of what Jose Melgar found, you start to lose sleep. Who was this person? What did they do to deserve a 6-ton portrait? How did they move it? Why did they bury it? Because here's the thing that really bends your brain. This head wasn't just abandoned, it was deliberately buried. Sometime in the distant past, someone took the time and effort to cover this massive sculpture with earth and let the jungle reclaim it. That's not something you do casually. That's not something you do because you're moving to a new neighborhood and can't fit it in the truck. That's something you do for a reason. Maybe it was religious. Maybe it was political. Maybe it was just really, really good vandalism, but somebody made a conscious decision to hide this thing away from the world. And here's the part that should really keep you up at night. If there was one head, there were probably more. If there was one, there was probably a whole civilization that nobody knew about. A civilization that was apparently moving multi-ton sculptures around Central America for fun. The single head that Jose Melgar discovered was like finding a single page from a book and realizing that the rest of the story was going to be absolutely wild. What Jose Melgar didn't know was that his discovery would eventually lead to the uncovering of an entire lost world. A world of massive stone heads, yes, but also of blood rituals and cosmic ball games and gods that were half human, half jaguar. A world where chocolate was a sacred drink and rubber was used for more than just making balls bounce. Over the next century, archaeologists would uncover evidence of cities and ceremonial centers of complex trade networks and sophisticated art. They would find evidence of a civilization that was already ancient when the pyramids of Egypt were being built, a civilization that laid the groundwork for everything that came after in Mesoamerica. But in 1862, Jose Melgar just knew that he'd found something extraordinary buried in his backyard. Something that didn't make sense according to everything he'd been taught about the past. Something that suggested that the history of the Americas was far more complex and far more interesting than anyone had imagined. He had no idea that he'd just introduced the world to the Olmecs, the mysterious mother culture of Mesoamerica. He had no idea that this single discovery would eventually lead to the realization that the Americas had been home to sophisticated civilizations for thousands of years. All he knew was that he'd found a face in the jungle, and it was looking at him with eyes that had seen the rise and fall of empires he couldn't even dream of. But to understand the significance of what Jose Melgar found, we need to understand who created it. We need to understand the people who lived in the swamps and jungles of ancient Mexico, who built the first great cities in the Americas, and who somehow managed to thrive in a place that was actively trying to kill them. We need to understand the Olmecs, and trust me, they were nothing like what you might expect. First things first, let's clear up a major misconception. Olmec isn't what these people called themselves. That name comes from the Aztecs who lived in the same general area more than 1,000 years later. In the Aztec language, Olmec means people of the rubber country, which is a bit like if future historians called us the people of plastic, because they found a lot of credit cards in our archaeological sites. We have no idea what the Olmecs actually called themselves. Their real name is lost to time, buried as deep as those stone heads Jose Melgar found in his field. For all we know, they called themselves something that translates to the Awesome Ones, or Masters of the Universe, or people who are really, really good at moving heavy things. But Olmec is what we're stuck with, so Olmec it is. Just remember that every time you hear that word, you're essentially using a nickname given to them by people who lived closer to us in time than they did to the actual Olmecs. It's like calling ancient Romans the spaghetti people, because that's what modern Italians are known for. Let's put these people in perspective, because when I say they were ancient, I mean they were ancient even by ancient standards. The Olmec civilization flourished from roughly 1500 BCE to 400 BCE. To put that in context, that might blow your mind a little. When the Olmecs were building their first major city, Troy was still a going concern. King Tutankhamun was ruling Egypt, and his tomb was still about 1,000 years in the future. The Roman Empire wouldn't even be a rumor for another 1,000 years. The Maya civilization that everyone thinks of as really old wouldn't hit its classical period for another 500 years after the Olmecs disappeared. Buddha wouldn't be born for another 600 years. Confucius was still 800 years in the future. The Greeks were just figuring out how to make decent pottery, and the idea of democracy was still a few centuries off. While Europeans were living in small villages and hitting each other with bronze weapons, the Olmecs were creating the first monumental architecture in the Americas, developing complex religious systems, and apparently having a great time playing ball games that ended in ritual sacrifice. They weren't just old, they were foundational. They were the prototype, the beta version, the proof of concept for everything that came after in Mesoamerica. Now let's talk about where these people decided to build their civilization, because their choice of real estate was interesting. And by interesting, I mean absolutely insane. The Olmecs lived in the tropical lowlands along the Gulf of Mexico, primarily in what are now the Mexican states of Veracruz and Tabasco. If you've never been to this part of the world, imagine Florida's Everglades but on steroids and with a bad attitude. We're talking about a landscape that was basically designed by Mother Nature as a practical joke. It's hot, and not just summer afternoon hot, but equatorial, make you question your life choices hot. The humidity is so thick you could practically swim through it. The air smells like mud and rotting vegetation and flowers that bloom specifically to attract things that bite. The rivers flood unpredictably, turning solid ground into swamp overnight. When they're not flooding, they're changing course, which means your village might wake up one morning to find that the river it depends on has decided to go somewhere else entirely. And everything, absolutely everything, either wants to bite you, sting you, or give you a fungal infection that would make a medieval plague doctor uncomfortable. Jaguars prowl the jungle looking for easy meals. Venomous snakes hang from trees like party streamers from hell. Crocodiles lurk in every body of water larger than a puddle. Mosquitoes carry diseases that don't even have names yet. This wasn't a place you built a civilization. This was a place you survived if you were lucky. This was a place that any reasonable person would take one look at and say, you know what, I think I'll try my luck somewhere else. Maybe somewhere with less murder vegetation and fewer things with teeth. And yet, not only did the Olmecs survive in this green hell, they thrived. They didn't just eke out a living, they built cities, they created art, they developed trade networks that stretched across hundreds of miles. They figured out agriculture in a place where the concept of seasons was more of a suggestion than a rule. They turned the very things that should have killed them into advantages. The rivers that flooded their villages also provided rich soil for their crops. The jungle that harbored predators also provided rubber trees which they turned into balls for their sacred games. The seasonal rains that made life unpredictable also filled their reservoirs and kept their crops watered. It's like they looked at one of the most hostile environments on the planet and said, "Challenge accepted." But how did they do it? How do you build a civilization in a place that's actively trying to kill you? How do you quarry massive blocks of stone when the nearest mountains are 60 miles away through swamp and jungle? How do you develop sophisticated art and religious systems when you're spending most of your time just trying not to be eaten by something with too many teeth? The answer, as we'll see, involves a combination of incredible ingenuity, religious fanaticism, and a level of social organization that shouldn't have been possible for people who were supposedly primitive. The Olmecs weren't just survivors, they were innovators. They invented, or at least perfected, technologies and concepts that would define Mesoamerican civilization for the next 2,000 years. They were among the first people in the Americas to create monumental stone sculpture, those giant heads that Jose Melgar found. They were just the beginning. The Olmecs created massive stone thrones, altars, and statues that required not just artistic skill, but engineering expertise that we're still trying to figure out. They developed the first complex calendar systems in the Americas. While Europeans were still scratching marks on cave walls to keep track of time, the Olmecs were calculating celestial cycles and predicting eclipses. They created the first writing system in the Western Hemisphere. Maybe. The evidence is debated, but there are stone blocks covered with symbols that could be the earliest example of American writing, predating Maya hieroglyphs by centuries. They were probably the first people to play the ball game that would become central to Mesoamerican culture. And when I say game, I'm using the term loosely, because this was less like sports and more like a religious ritual that occasionally ended with the losing team being sacrificed to the gods. Oh, and they invented chocolate. Well, they were among the first to figure out that you could turn cacao beans into a drink. It wasn't the sweet, creamy hot chocolate you might sip while binge-watching Netflix. It was bitter spicy and probably caffeinated enough to make your heart explode. But hey, chocolate is chocolate. Here's what makes the Olmecs truly remarkable. They were the foundation. Everything that came after in Mesoamerica built on what they started. The Maya calendar system, based on Olmec innovations, the Aztec pantheon of gods. Many of them can be traced back to Olmec religious concepts. The ball courts found throughout Mexico and Central America, the Olmecs built the first ones. They were like the original programmers who wrote the base code that everyone else would modify and improve for the next 2,000 years. Maya civilization, Zapotec culture, the mighty Aztec empire. All of them were running on Olmec software, updated and expanded, but fundamentally based on the same core concepts. It's remarkable when you think about it. This civilization that most people have never heard of, that flourished in one of the most inhospitable places on Earth, created the template for an entire hemisphere's worth of advanced cultures. They were the pilot episode, the proof of concept, the successful beta test for Mesoamerican civilization. And like all good prototypes, they established the basic parameters that everyone who came after would work within: monumental architecture, complex religious systems, sophisticated art, advanced mathematics and astronomy, and ball games that were way more intense than anything you played in high school. But here's the thing that makes the Olmec story even more intriguing. They didn't just fade away gradually. Around 400 BCE, after more than 1,000 years of dominance, they essentially vanished. Not all at once, not in a single catastrophic event, but like a song that slowly fades out until you realize the music has stopped. Their cities were abandoned. Their trade networks collapsed. Their massive stone monuments were deliberately buried or destroyed. It was like they decided to ghost history, leaving behind only clues for future archaeologists to puzzle over. What happened to them? Why did the mother culture of Mesoamerica suddenly pack up and disappear? We'll get to that mystery later, but for now, just keep that question in the back of your mind. How does a civilization that successful, that innovative, that foundational, just stop? But before we can understand their disappearance, we need to understand their achievements. And the most famous of those achievements, the thing that put them on the archaeological map, are those massive stone heads that Jose Melgar found buried in his field. Heads that, as we're about to discover, represent one of the most impressive feats of engineering and logistics in the ancient world. Alright, let's talk about the elephant in the room. Or rather, the 17 massive stone heads scattered across the Mexican landscape like someone was playing the world's most expensive game of lawn darts. 17 colossal heads have been discovered so far, and each one represents a logistics problem that should have been impossible to solve with the technology available 3,000 years ago. We're not talking about life-sized portraits here. These things range from about 6 tons on the small end to a mind-bending 50 tons for the largest one. Let me put that in perspective for you. Your average sedan weighs about 1.5 tons. So the biggest Olmec head weighs as much as about 30 Honda Civics stacked on top of each other. The medium-sized ones weigh as much as a fully loaded garbage truck. Even the small ones weigh more than 2 pickup trucks. And remember, this is just the weight of the finished product. These weren't carved from convenient chunks of stone lying around the neighborhood. These came from massive boulders that were even heavier before the Olmecs spent months carving away everything that wasn't a face. The material they used makes the whole endeavor even more impressive, and by impressive, I mean completely insane. These heads are carved from basalt, a volcanic rock that's incredibly hard and durable. It's perfect for sculpture because it holds detail well and doesn't erode easily. It's also dense as hell and about as easy to work with as trying to carve butter with a wet noodle, except the butter is made of rock and wants to break your tools. Basalt is formed when lava cools quickly, usually near volcanic activity. It's tough, it's heavy, and it takes specialized tools and enormous amounts of time to shape into anything resembling art. Working with basalt using stone and wooden tools is like trying to perform brain surgery with a spoon. It's technically possible, but it requires patient skill and probably a lot of cursing in languages that are now extinct. The Olmecs not only figured out how to work with this unforgiving material, they mastered it. The detail on these heads is extraordinary. You can see individual facial features, expressions, even what appear to be helmets or headdresses with intricate designs. This wasn't just functional carving, this was artistry of the highest level. Now here's where things get really interesting, and by interesting I mean the kind of problem that makes modern engineers wake up in cold sweats. The basalt didn't come from next door. It came from the Tuxtla Mountains, specifically from a place called Cerro Sintepec. The distance from the quarry sites to the major Olmec centers like San Lorenzo and La Venta ranges from about 60 to 150 kilometers. That's 40 to 95 miles for those of you who think in freedom units. Doesn't sound too bad, right? I mean, you could drive that distance in an hour or two on a decent highway. But the Olmecs didn't have highways. They didn't have wheels for transportation. They didn't have horses, oxen, or any other beasts of burden. They had rivers, swamps, jungle, and human muscle power. Oh, and did I mention that they had to get these multi-ton blocks across multiple rivers through miles of swampland and over terrain that changes from solid ground to quicksand depending on the season? Let's walk through what moving one of these heads would have involved. Because once you start thinking about the logistics, you start to question whether the Olmecs were actually human, or if they were some kind of ancient civilization of incredibly motivated ants. First, you have to quarry the stone. This means finding a suitable boulder in the mountains, one that's big enough to carve your head out of, but not so big that it's impossible to move. You need to shape it enough to reduce the weight, but not so much that you damage the stone during transport. This probably took weeks of work by skilled craftsmen using stone tools and wooden levers. Then comes the fun part, getting it down the mountain. Picture trying to lower a 50-ton block of stone down a mountainside using only ropes, wooden rollers, and human power. No cranes, no pulleys, no modern rigging equipment. Just a lot of very strong people. A lot of rope made from plant fibers, and probably a lot of prayers to whatever gods were responsible for not letting massive stones crush entire work crews. Once you get the stone to the base of the mountains, you've solved maybe 10% of the problem. Now you have to transport it across 150 kilometers of some of the most challenging terrain on the planet. The current best guess among archaeologists is that they used a combination of overland transport and river rafts. For the overland portions, they probably used wooden rollers, constantly moving them from the back of the stone to the front as it was pushed and pulled by teams of laborers. Think of it like a conveyor belt made of logs operated entirely by human power. For river crossings, they would have had to build massive rafts capable of supporting 50 tons of stone, plus the weight of the people directing the operation. We're talking about rafts the size of small houses made from local materials engineered to be stable enough that they wouldn't tip over and send months of work to the bottom of the river. Let's talk numbers because the human effort involved in this operation was staggering. Estimates suggest that moving one of the larger heads would have required anywhere from 1,000 to 1,500 people working in coordination. Not just for a day or a week, but for months. Think about the last time you tried to move a couch up a flight of stairs with a couple of friends. Remember the arguments about who wasn't pulling their weight, the sore backs, the moment when someone suggested just leaving it on the landing forever. Now multiply that frustration by 10,000 and stretch it out over several months while dealing with mosquitoes, tropical diseases, flooding, and the constant threat of jaguars. It would have been like organizing the world's worst corporate team-building exercise, except instead of trust falls and rope courses, you're hauling multi-ton boulders through a swamp while being eaten alive by insects. The logistics of feeding and organizing this many people would have been a nightmare all by itself. You need supply lines to keep everyone fed. You need medical care for injuries, and there were definitely injuries. You need a command structure to coordinate the effort. You need specialists who understand river navigation stone, working, and logistics. This wasn't just a construction project. It was a military-scale operation requiring the resources of an entire civilization. So why go through all this trouble? What was the point of creating these massive portraits that required such enormous effort to produce? The answer tells us something important about Olmec society and how power worked in their world. These heads weren't religious artifacts, they weren't representations of gods or mythical beings. They were portraits of real people, specific individuals who were important enough to deserve a 40-ton monument to their greatness. Each head has distinctive features. You can see personality in these faces. Some look stern and authoritative. Others seem more approachable, almost friendly. They're wearing different types of headdresses or helmets, each unique and carefully detailed. These were meant to be recognizable portraits of actual rulers or important leaders. In other words, these were the ultimate status symbols. Forget a Rolex or a Ferrari. If you were really important in Olmec society, you got a 40-ton statue of your face that could be seen from miles away and would last for thousands of years. It was a way of saying, I'm so powerful, so important that I can command thousands of people to spend months of their lives creating a monument to me. I can mobilize the resources of an entire civilization just to make sure everyone remembers what I look like. The heads were advertisements for power carved in stone and placed in prominent locations, where they would dominate the landscape and remind everyone who was in charge. But here's where the story takes a dark turn that archaeologists are still trying to figure out. Many of these heads weren't just abandoned when the Olmec civilization collapsed. They were deliberately buried. Picture this, you've spent months, maybe years, creating this incredible monument. It represents the pinnacle of your artistic and engineering capabilities. It's a portrait of your most important leader carved with incredible skill and placed in a position of honor. And then, for reasons we can only guess at, you dig a hole and bury it. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't the result of natural processes like flooding or landslides. These heads were carefully covered with earth and left to be reclaimed by the jungle. It was deliberate destruction on a massive scale. Why would you bury a 50-ton work of art? Why would you hide away something that took so much effort to create and transport? The theories range from the practical to the mystical, and none of them are particularly comforting. Maybe it was rebellion. Perhaps the common people, tired of hauling massive stones around for the glory of their rulers, finally had enough and decided to literally bury the symbols of their oppression. It would be like the ultimate act of civil disobedience. You want a giant statue of your face? Fine. Here's where we think it belongs. Maybe it was conquest. When a new group took over, they might have buried the monuments of the previous rulers as a way of erasing their legitimacy. It's the ancient equivalent of tearing down statues, except instead of using ropes and trucks, they used shovels and probably a lot of very motivated laborers. Or maybe it was something stranger, something that reflects the complex spiritual beliefs of the Olmecs. Perhaps they believed that when a ruler died, his portrait needed to be killed, too buried like a body, so that his spirit could properly transition to the afterlife. The head wasn't being destroyed, it was being transformed, sent to join its subject in whatever realm the dead inhabited. We don't know for sure, and that uncertainty is part of what makes the Olmec story so compelling. These weren't just master engineers and artists. They were people with complex motivations and beliefs that we're still trying to understand. Let's step back and appreciate what the Olmecs accomplished with these heads, because from a purely technical standpoint, what they did was extraordinary. They figured out how to quarry massive blocks of stone using only stone tools. They developed transportation methods that could move multi-ton loads across impossible terrain. They created lifting and positioning systems that could place these heads exactly where they wanted them. They did all of this without metal tools, without wheels, without draft animals, and without any of the mechanical advantages that we take for granted. Modern engineers who study the heads are consistently impressed by the sophistication of the techniques involved, the precision of the carving, the engineering required for transport, the social organization necessary to coordinate such massive projects. It all points to a level of technological and social sophistication that was far ahead of its time. These heads represent one of humanity's earliest examples of monumental art, but they also represent a level of engineering prowess that wouldn't be matched in the Americas for centuries. The Olmecs weren't just artists, they were problem solvers on a scale that's hard to comprehend. The physical features of the heads have generated more controversy than almost any other aspect of Olmec culture. The broad noses, full lips, and distinctive facial structure have led to decades of debate about who the Olmecs really were and where they came from. Some people have argued that these features suggest African origins, proposing that ancient African peoples somehow made it to the Americas thousands of years before Columbus. It's a theory that's been popular in certain circles, but it's also one that lacks any real archaeological or genetic evidence. The truth is less exotic, but more interesting. The features on the heads are entirely consistent with the indigenous populations of the region, both ancient and modern. The Olmecs looked like Olmecs because they were Olmecs, a distinct people who developed their own culture and artistic traditions in the tropical lowlands of Mexico. The heads show us that physical diversity has always been a part of human populations. The Olmecs carved what they saw, and what they saw were the faces of their leaders, with all the individual variation and distinctive features that make each person unique. It's worth noting that attributing the achievements of indigenous American cultures to outside influences is not just historically inaccurate, it's also disrespectful. The Olmecs were perfectly capable of creating sophisticated art and complex civilizations without any help from ancient visitors. Their achievements stand on their own merit. The level of skill required to create these heads suggests the existence of specialized workshops and master craftsmen who devoted their entire careers to stone carving. This wasn't something you could knock out over a weekend. Each head probably took months of careful work by teams of skilled artisans. The tools they used were made of stone, wood, and plant fibers. No metal chisels, no power tools, no modern measuring devices. They shaped these massive blocks using hammerstones, wooden wedges, sand for abrasion, and an enormous amount of patience and skill. The precision they achieved is remarkable. The proportions are correct. The symmetry is nearly perfect, and the details are carved with a level of accuracy that's hard to achieve even with modern tools. These weren't rough approximations, they were carefully planned and executed works of art. Each head also shows evidence of being carved by different hands, different workshops with their own styles and techniques. You can see variations in how details are handled, differences in approach and execution that suggest a thriving community of master sculptors who were probably trained through apprenticeship systems. The heads are what made the Olmecs famous, but they're just one part of a much larger and stranger story. They're the marquee attraction, the thing that gets people interested in learning more about this mysterious civilization. But the real Olmec story goes far beyond stone carving and logistics nightmares. It goes into the realm of religious beliefs so complex and sometimes so disturbing that they make the heads look like simple portrait photography. We're talking about a people who believed their rulers could transform into jaguars, who played ball games where losing meant death, who created art that depicts beings that are part human, part animal, and all nightmare fuel, who developed religious practices that involved ritual bloodletting, human sacrifice, and spiritual beliefs that were so intense they shaped every aspect of their civilization. The heads were impressive, sure, but they were also just the beginning. They were the calling cards, the advertisements, the way the Olmecs announced to the world that they were a force to be reckoned with. But if you really want to understand the Olmecs, if you want to know what made them tick and what drove them to accomplish impossible things in an impossible place, you need to look beyond the stone faces and into their soul. And their souls, as we're about to discover, were populated by gods with fangs, rulers who could shapeshift, and spiritual beliefs that were beautiful, terrifying, and completely unlike anything the world had seen before. Okay, so the heads are incredible feats of engineering and artistry. They represent power. They required impossible logistics, and they've been staring out from the jungle for thousands of years, like ancient billboards advertising rulers whose names we'll never know. That's impressive, sure, but it's also almost normal. Powerful people have been commissioning massive portraits of themselves since the dawn of civilization. But now we need to talk about the weird stuff. And when I say weird, I mean the kind of weird that makes you check your doors are locked before you go to sleep. We need to talk about the Olmecs' obsession with jaguars, and specifically their belief that the line between human and jaguar wasn't as fixed as you might think. Welcome to the world of Olmec, where jaguars were the most powerful people in society, could apparently transform into the apex predator of the Americas, and where the gods themselves were chimeric beings that were part human, part big cat, and all nightmare fuel. First, let's talk about jaguars themselves, because if you're going to understand Olmec religion and worldview, you need to understand why these particular cats loom so large in their imagination. The jaguar was the apex predator of Mesoamerica. It still is, actually, though there are far fewer of them now than there were 3,000 years ago. These aren't your house cats who knock things off tables for entertainment. Jaguars are the third largest cats in the world after tigers and lions. They can weigh up to 250 pounds of pure muscle stealth and bad attitude. But here's what made them particularly terrifying and fascinating to the Olmecs. Jaguars are uniquely versatile predators. They're equally comfortable on land, in water, and in trees. They're excellent swimmers. Unlike most cats, they actually enjoy water and are perfectly happy to hunt caimans and fish. They're incredible climbers who can leap between tree branches like furry ninjas, and they're nearly silent when they hunt, capable of stalking prey through dense jungle without making a sound. To the Olmecs, this versatility meant that jaguars could move between worlds. They weren't just land animals, they were creatures that could transition between the terrestrial realm, the aquatic underworld, and the celestial canopy. They were living, breathing portals between different layers of reality. Oh, and they hunt primarily at night, which meant they were associated with darkness, the underworld, and all the mysterious forces that came alive when the sun went down. In a world without electric lights, where nighttime meant being surrounded by the sounds of predators and the unknown, the jaguar's night vision and nocturnal hunting habits made it seem almost supernatural. Now here's where things get really interesting. And by interesting, I mean deeply unsettling. The Olmecs didn't just respect jaguars or worship them from a distance. They believed that certain powerful individuals could actually become jaguars. This wasn't metaphorical. This wasn't about having a spirit animal or feeling a special connection to big cats. The Olmecs created art that depicts actual transformation humans in the process of shifting into jaguars and vice versa. We have dozens of small sculptures, masks, and reliefs that show beings that are clearly in transition between human and jaguar forms. These aren't stylized representations or symbolic art. These are detailed, anatomically specific depictions of transformation in progress. Picture a face that's recognizably human, but with a mouth that's too wide, filled with fangs instead of human teeth, eyes that are almond-shaped and predatory, hands that are elongating into claws. Sometimes you can see fur beginning to sprout from human skin or human features melting into feline ones. The artistry is incredible, but it's also deeply disturbing. These sculptures have an uncanny valley quality that makes your skin crawl. They're not cute anthropomorphic animals like you might see in a Disney movie. They're genuinely frightening representations of beings that are neither fully human nor fully animal. Some of the most unsettling where jaguar art depicts beings that combine human infant features with jaguar characteristics. These sculptures show faces that have the pudgy cheeks and large eyes of babies, but with snarling mouths full of fangs and expressions that are far too knowing for any human child. Why infants? The prevailing theory is that children were seen as beings who existed closer to the supernatural realm. They hadn't been fully socialized into human society, hadn't learned to suppress their connection to the natural and spiritual worlds. In many shamanic traditions, children are believed to have access to spiritual insights that adults have lost. So, a were-jaguar infant would represent the ultimate synthesis of spiritual power, the innocence and otherworldly connection of childhood, combined with the predatory strength and supernatural mobility of the jaguar. It's a combination that's both powerful and profoundly disturbing. Imagine encountering one of these sculptures in a dark temple, lit only by flickering torches. The baby face would initially seem harmless, even cute, until you notice the fangs and the predatory expression. It's the kind of thing that would give you nightmares for weeks. The were-jaguar concept wasn't just artistic fancy, it was central to Olmec religious practice and social organization. The ability to transform into a jaguar was apparently reserved for the most powerful shamans and rulers, people who had trained for years to access supernatural abilities. In shamanic traditions around the world, animal transformation is a common theme. Shamans are often believed to have spirit animals that they can embody during ritual trances, allowing them to access the animal's abilities and perspectives. But the Olmec version seems to have been particularly intense and specific. The transformation wasn't just spiritual, it was believed to be physical. The most powerful Olmec leaders could literally become jaguars, gaining the animal's strength, stealth, and ability to move between worlds. This wasn't just a metaphor for leadership qualities. It was an actual supernatural power that set the ruling class apart from ordinary people. Think about the implications of this belief system. If you're a common farmer or craftsman and you believe that your ruler can literally transform into a 250-pound killing machine with supernatural abilities, you're probably going to be pretty respectful of their authority. It's the ultimate form of divine right, not just appointed by the gods, but capable of becoming something divine yourself. Try to imagine what it would have been like to witness one of these transformation rituals. You're in a ceremonial center deep in the night when jaguars are most active. The only light comes from torches that cast dancing shadows on stone walls covered with were-jaguar art. The air is thick with the smoke of copal incense, a resin that burns with a sweet, otherworldly smell that's still used in Mesoamerican religious ceremonies today. The smoke would have been psychoactive, helping to induce the trance states necessary for spiritual transformation. The shaman or ruler begins to chant in languages that were already ancient when these ceremonies were taking place. They're wearing masks and costumes designed to blur the line between human and jaguar, with fanged faces and spotted patterns that flicker and shift in the torchlight. As the ceremony progresses, the chanting becomes more intense, the movements more animalistic. The participant enters a trance state, and in the minds of the observers, they're witnessing an actual transformation. The human is becoming the jaguar, accessing powers that ordinary mortals can't even comprehend. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the ceremonial center, real jaguars are calling to each other with roars that sound like the voices of gods. The were-jaguar concept served multiple functions in Olmec society, and understanding them gives us insight into how complex political and religious systems can emerge from basic human psychology. On one level, it was about fear management. The Olmecs lived in constant proximity to actual jaguars, animals that could and would kill humans if given the opportunity. By incorporating the jaguar into their religious system, by claiming that their most powerful people could become jaguars, they were psychologically domesticating one of their greatest threats. It's a bit like how modern people create superhero stories about characters who can control dangerous forces like radiation or electricity. We take something that frightens us and imagine what it would be like to master it rather than be victimized by it. But it was also about social control. If your ruler can literally become a supernatural predator, you're going to think twice before challenging their authority. The were-jaguar concept created a form of political power that was literally otherworldly, and it was about spiritual aspiration. The jaguar represented everything that humans wish they could be: powerful, stealthy, capable of moving between different realms of existence. The were-jaguar was the ultimate expression of human potential, the idea that the right person with the right training could transcend the limitations of ordinary mortality. The artistic representations of were-jaguars that the Olmecs created are among the most sophisticated and psychologically complex art ever produced in the ancient Americas. These weren't simple religious icons or decorative objects. They were studies in transformation, explorations of the boundary between human and animal, between natural and supernatural. The technical skill required to create these pieces was extraordinary. Working with stone, jade, and clay, Olmec artists managed to capture moments of transformation with a realism that's still striking today. They understood anatomy well enough to show exactly how a human face might look as it began to sprout fangs, or how human hands might appear as they developed claws. But beyond the technical achievement, there's an emotional and psychological depth to these pieces that's rare in ancient art. These sculptures convey a sense of power, but also of alienation and otherness. The were-jaguar beings look powerful, but they also look isolated, caught between worlds and belonging fully to neither. The were-jaguar concept might seem like ancient superstition to modern audiences, but it taps into psychological and spiritual themes that are still relevant today. The idea of transformation, of accessing hidden aspects of ourselves, of becoming something more than ordinary human limitations allow. These are themes that appear in everything from superhero movies to modern shamanic practices. The Olmec were-jaguar represents one of humanity's earliest explorations of these ideas, expressed through art and religious practice with a sophistication that's still impressive today. They were grappling with fundamental questions about human nature, spiritual potential, and the relationship between civilization and the wild. And they were doing it in a way that was beautiful, terrifying, and completely original. The were-jaguar wasn't borrowed from some other culture or adapted from earlier traditions. It was a uniquely Olmec contribution to human religious and artistic expression. But the were-jaguar concept was just one aspect of Olmec religious life, and not necessarily the most intense one. If the idea of shape-shifting rulers and infant-faced predator gods seems extreme, well, we're just getting started. Because the Olmecs didn't just believe in transformation and supernatural power. They believed that these powers required feeding. They believed that the gods who granted the ability to become jaguars demanded payment in return. And that payment, as we're about to discover, was written in blood. We've talked about the were-jaguars, those terrifying shape-shifting deities and rulers who could transform between human and feline forms. But transformation comes with a cost, and in the Olmec world, that cost was paid in blood. Literally. The Olmecs believed that supernatural power required supernatural payment. The gods who granted the ability to become jaguars, who controlled the rains and the crops and the success of their civilization, needed to be fed. And what they hungered for wasn't corn or jade or even gold. They wanted the most precious substance in the human body, blood. This wasn't a metaphor. This wasn't symbolic. The Olmecs practiced ritual bloodletting on a scale, and with a sophistication that makes modern medical procedures look casual by comparison. They had turned bleeding into an art form, a religious practice, and a political statement, all rolled into one incredibly painful package. Ritual bloodletting in Olmec society wasn't limited to prisoners or enemies. The people who bled the most, who suffered the most, were the rulers and priests themselves. The most powerful people in society were expected to endure the most pain, to sacrifice the most of themselves, to maintain the cosmic balance. Picture this: you're the most important person in your city. You have thousands of people who depend on your leadership, who believe that your spiritual power keeps their world functioning. And your job description includes regularly piercing your own body with sharp objects until you bleed enough to satisfy the gods. The tools they used for this were not designed for comfort. We're talking about stingray spines, which are serrated and barbed like organic torture devices. Obsidian blades that were sharper than modern surgical scalpels, but designed to cause maximum tissue damage. Shark teeth that had been specially prepared for ceremonial use. Thorns from plants that had been selected specifically for their ability to cause pain. And the locations they chose for bloodletting weren't random. They targeted the most sensitive and symbolically important parts of the body. Tongues were pierced because speech was sacred, the means by which humans communicated with the divine. Ears were targeted because hearing was how one received messages from the gods. And then there were other areas that I'll mention delicately. The genitals, both male and female, were considered particularly potent sources of life-giving blood. Let's walk through what one of these bloodletting ceremonies would have looked like, because understanding the process helps us understand how central this practice was to Olmec, religious and political life. The ceremony would begin at dawn or dusk during the liminal times when the boundary between the human world and the spirit world was believed to be thinnest. The participant, usually a ruler or high priest, would fast for days beforehand, purifying their body and preparing their spirit for the ordeal. The location would be carefully chosen, usually a ceremonial platform or temple that had been consecrated for such purposes. The area would be cleaned and prepared with specific ritual objects, jade bloodletters, specially prepared papers made from bark that would absorb the blood, copal incense to carry prayers to the gods, and often mirrors made from polished obsidian that would reflect the spiritual transformation taking place. The participant would be dressed in elaborate ceremonial garb, often including masks or headdresses that incorporated jaguar imagery. The costume itself was part of the transformation, helping the human consciousness prepare to commune with divine forces. As the ceremony began, assistants would burn copal incense, filling the air with sweet psychoactive smoke that would help induce the trance states necessary for spiritual communication. Chanting and drumming would create a rhythmic soundscape that would further alter consciousness and build psychological intensity. Then came the cutting. The bloodletter, often a stingray spine that had been ritually blessed and prepared, would be used to pierce the designated body part. But this wasn't a quick cut. The process was slow, deliberate, designed to maximize both the pain and the amount of blood produced. The blood wasn't just allowed to drip onto the ground. It was carefully collected on specially prepared papers made from the bark of fig trees. These papers had often been decorated with religious symbols and prepared through their own ritual process. Once the papers were soaked with blood, they were burned as offerings to the gods. The Olmecs believed that the smoke from burning blood-soaked papers carried their prayers and offerings directly to the divine realm. The more blood, the more potent the offering, the more likely the gods were to respond favorably to their requests. But sometimes the blood itself was preserved and used in other ceremonies. It might be mixed with other sacred substances to create ritual paints for decorating temples or participants. It might be offered to sacred objects or statues. In some cases, it might even be consumed as a way of literally incorporating the spiritual power of the bloodletter. The psychological effect of these ceremonies on both participants and observers must have been intense. The combination of pain, blood loss, psychoactive smoke, rhythmic music, and religious fervor would have created altered states of consciousness that participants would have interpreted as direct communication with the divine. Now, we need to talk about something darker, something that the evidence suggests, but that we'd rather not think about: the possibility that the Olmecs practiced human sacrifice, possibly including the sacrifice of children. The archaeological evidence is debated, but it's troubling. Excavations at Olmec sites have uncovered the remains of infants and young children in ritual contexts, often associated with jaguar imagery and ceremonial objects. The bones show signs of deliberate cutting and arrangement that suggest they weren't simply burials, but active sacrificial offerings. Why children? The theories are disturbing, but consistent with what we know about Olmec religious beliefs. Children, especially infants, were seen as beings who existed closer to the divine realm. They hadn't been fully socialized into human society, hadn't learned to suppress their spiritual connections. In the Olmec worldview, they were more effective messengers to the gods precisely because they were more innocent, more pure. The jaguar connection makes this even more unsettling. In nature, jaguars are known to prey on young animals, and the Olmec were jaguar deities, may have been believed to have similar appetites. Offering children to jaguar gods may have been seen as feeding the deities their preferred food. But let's be clear about something: this is speculation based on limited evidence. We don't know for certain that the Olmecs practiced child sacrifice, and if they did, we don't know how common it was or under what circumstances it occurred. What we do know is that the possibility exists, and it's consistent with the intensity and extremity of their other religious practices. To understand why the Olmecs might have engaged in such extreme practices, we need to understand their view of the cosmos and humanity's place within it. They didn't see the universe as a stable, predictable system that would continue functioning regardless of human action. They saw it as a delicate balance that required constant maintenance through human intervention. In their worldview, the gods had created the world and established the natural cycles that kept it functioning. But they weren't benevolent caretakers who would maintain the system out of love for humanity. They were powerful, but demanding entities who required payment for their services. The rains that watered the crops, the floods that deposited fertile soil, the seasonal cycles that allowed agriculture to flourish. All of these were gifts from the gods that had to be earned through sacrifice and suffering. The more important the request, the more valuable the offering had to be. Blood was seen as the ultimate offering because it represented life itself. When you gave your blood to the gods, you were literally giving them a part of your life force. And when rulers and priests engaged in bloodletting, they were demonstrating their willingness to sacrifice themselves for the good of their people. It was a form of cosmic reciprocity. The gods give life, humans give blood. The gods provide fertile land, humans provide painful offerings. The balance had to be maintained, or the entire system would collapse. Okay, let's take a collective breath here. We've been talking about blood rituals, shape-shifting rulers, and possible child sacrifice for a while now, and I think we all need a moment to process the darker aspects of Olmec religious practice. So, let's talk about something wonderful they gave the world: chocolate. Yes, the same people who may have sacrificed children to jaguar gods also invented one of humanity's favorite treats. The complexity of human civilization, folks. The Olmecs were among the first people to figure out that the seeds of the cacao tree could be processed into something delicious and spiritually significant. But before you start picturing ancient Mesoamericans sitting around eating Hershey's Kisses, let me set the record straight about what Olmec chocolate actually was. First, it wasn't sweet at all. Sugar wasn't available in the Americas, and the Olmecs didn't add honey or any other sweeteners to their cacao preparations. They ground cacao beans with water, chili peppers, and sometimes maize to create a drink that was more like a bitter energy drink from hell than anything you'd recognize as chocolate today. Second, it wasn't a casual treat. Cacao was sacred, associated with the gods, and reserved for special ceremonies and important people. It was believed to have spiritual properties, to be capable of inducing visions and facilitating communication with the divine. Drinking chocolate wasn't about satisfying a sweet tooth, it was about accessing supernatural power. The preparation process was elaborate and ritualized. The cacao beans were roasted, ground on special stones, and mixed with water using techniques that created a thick foam on top of the drink. The foam was particularly important. It was seen as the spiritual essence of the beverage, the part that contained the most power. The drink was often consumed during religious ceremonies, sometimes by the same priests and rulers who were engaged in bloodletting rituals. It's possible that the caffeine and other alkaloids in cacao helped participants endure the pain of ritual cutting and enhance the altered states of consciousness that were central to Olmec religious practice. The chocolate example illustrates something important about Olmec culture. They didn't separate the sacred from the everyday in the way that modern people might. Everything was connected, everything had spiritual significance, and even something as simple as a drink could be a portal to the divine. This integrated worldview helps explain why their religious practices were so intense. If you believe that everything you do has cosmic significance, if you think that the survival of your civilization depends on maintaining proper relationships with supernatural forces, then extreme measures don't seem extreme anymore. They seem necessary. The bloodletting, the possible human sacrifice, the elaborate ceremonies involving were jaguar transformation. All of these were part of a coherent system of beliefs about how the universe worked and what humans needed to do to keep it functioning. It wasn't about cruelty or barbarism, it was about responsibility. The Olmec elite believed that they bore the burden of maintaining cosmic balance, and they were willing to endure incredible pain and make terrible sacrifices to fulfill that responsibility. The evidence for these religious practices comes not just from archaeological remains, but from the extensive artistic record the Olmecs left behind. They documented their beliefs and practices in stone carvings, jade sculptures, and ceramic figurines with a detail and consistency that suggests these weren't just occasional rituals, but central aspects of their culture. We have dozens of sculptures that show figures in the act of bloodletting, holding the obsidian blades or stingray spines used for the ceremony. We have depictions of the papers used to collect blood, of the burning of offerings, of the elaborate costumes worn during ceremonies. The art is both beautiful and disturbing, showing figures in obvious pain but also in states of spiritual ecstasy. The faces of bloodletters often show expressions that combine suffering with transcendence, pain with divine connection. These aren't the faces of victims being tortured. These are the faces of people who believe they're performing the most important work in the world, who see their suffering as noble and necessary. It's religious art that captures the psychological complexity of extreme spiritual practice. For modern audiences, the Olmec approach to religion can be difficult to understand or accept. We live in a world where spiritual practice is generally associated with comfort, peace, and positive emotions. The idea that religious devotion might require physical pain and blood sacrifice seems foreign and disturbing. But it's worth remembering that the Olmecs lived in a much more precarious world than we do. They were constantly threatened by natural disasters, crop failures, diseases, and conflicts with neighboring groups. Their survival depended on forces they couldn't control or fully understand. In that context, the willingness to endure pain and make extreme sacrifices in order to influence those forces makes a certain kind of sense. If you believe that your suffering can prevent famines, that your blood can ensure good harvests, that your pain can protect your community from disaster, then bloodletting becomes not just acceptable, but heroic. The Olmecs weren't sadistic or primitive. They were people trying to survive and thrive in a challenging world using the best tools and knowledge available to them. Their religious practices were extreme, but they were also sophisticated based on complex philosophical and theological concepts that took centuries to develop. The religious intensity of the Olmecs didn't die with their civilization. The practices they developed, bloodletting human sacrifice, the integration of political and religious authority, were inherited and expanded by later Mesoamerican cultures. The Maya took bloodletting to even greater extremes, developing more sophisticated tools and more elaborate ceremonies. The Aztecs made human sacrifice central to their imperial ideology, conducting mass offerings that dwarfed anything the Olmecs had attempted. But the Olmecs were the ones who established the template, who first developed the idea that maintaining cosmic balance required human suffering and sacrifice. They were the ones who first argued that rulers needed to be more than just political leaders. They needed to be spiritual intermediaries willing to endure pain for the good of their people. It's a legacy that's both impressive and troubling, a reminder that human religious creativity can produce ideas that are simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. But speaking of terrifying, we haven't even gotten to the really intense part of Olmec culture yet. Because all of this, the bloodletting, the were-jaguars, the possible human sacrifice, was just the warm-up act. The main event was a game, a sport you might say. Except in this sport, losing didn't just mean going home disappointed. Losing meant not going home at all. We've covered the were-jaguars, the bloodletting, the possible human sacrifice, and the sacred chocolate that could induce visions. You might think we've reached the peak of Olmec intensity, the maximum level of what the hell were these people thinking? Well, hold on to your hats because we're about to discuss something that makes all of that look like a relaxing weekend hobby. We're about to talk about the Mesoamerican ball game, the sport that the Olmecs invented, and that would become the deadliest game in human history. This wasn't soccer. This wasn't basketball. This wasn't any kind of recreational activity that you'd recognize as normal human entertainment. This was a ritual combat sport where the stakes were literally life and death, where the outcome determined not just who won a trophy, but who walked away breathing. The Olmecs built the first ball courts in the Americas, establishing a tradition that would spread across Mesoamerica and continue for over 2,000 years. And from the very beginning, this game was about much more than athletic competition. It was about cosmic balance, religious devotion, and the willingness to risk everything for the chance at glory. Olmec ball courts weren't casual playgrounds. These were sacred spaces, carefully designed ceremonial centers that were believed to be gateways between the mortal and divine worlds. The courts themselves were architectural marvels, sunken playing areas flanked by sloped walls that created an enclosed arena where sound would echo and amplify every bounce of the ball, every shout from the players, every gasp from the spectators. The shape of the courts was symbolic, representing the underworld, where the gods played their own cosmic version of the game. When humans entered these courts, they weren't just playing sports. They were reenacting divine conflicts, participating in the same cosmic dramas that determined the fate of the universe. Picture stepping into one of these courts for the first time. The walls rise up around you, like the sides of a canyon carved with reliefs of were-jaguars and other supernatural beings who seem to watch your every move. The acoustics are perfect. Every sound is amplified and echoed back at you, creating an otherworldly auditory experience that would have been both thrilling and terrifying. The floor is perfectly level-made from carefully fitted stones that have been polished smooth by generations of players. The walls slope at precisely calculated angles designed to keep the ball in play while creating the most challenging possible playing conditions. This isn't a field thrown together for a quick game. This is a precision-engineered arena built for the most important contests imaginable. Now let's talk about the ball itself, because this wasn't something you'd want to catch with your bare hands during a friendly game of catch. The Olmecs made their balls from solid rubber harvested from rubber trees and processed into a dense, heavy sphere that weighed between 8 and 9 pounds. 9 pounds might not sound like much until you realize that's about the weight of a bowling ball, except this ball was designed to bounce unpredictably and move at high speeds. Getting hit by one of these balls was like being struck by a rubber-coated cannonball. It could easily break bones, knock you unconscious, or worse. The rubber used to make these balls was processed using techniques that the Olmecs had perfected over generations. They knew how to extract latex from rubber trees, how to process it to achieve the right consistency and elasticity, and how to form it into spheres that would bounce properly while maintaining their shape through hours of intense play. The balls were often decorated with religious symbols or carved with patterns that had spiritual significance. Some balls were even believed to contain supernatural power, to be imbued with the essence of the gods who presided over the game. Playing with one of these balls wasn't just athletic competition, it was handling sacred objects that could determine your spiritual fate. The rules of the Olmec ball game were complex and varied from region to region, but the basic premise was consistent. Two teams would compete to keep the ball in play and score points by getting it through goals or hitting specific targets. But here's the catch that made this game uniquely terrifying. Players could only touch the ball with their hips, thighs, and shoulders. No hands, no feet, no head. You had to keep a 9-pound rubber cannonball in play using only the most awkward and vulnerable parts of your body. Imagine trying to play volleyball with a bowling ball while you're only allowed to hit it with your hip. Now imagine that your life depends on winning. The protective gear that players wore was elaborate but offered limited protection. Hip yokes made from leather and padding arm guards, knee pads, all designed to provide some cushioning against the impact of the ball, but nothing that would completely protect you from serious injury. Players would spend years training for this game, developing the strength reflexes and technique necessary to control the ball effectively. It required incredible athletic ability, precise timing, and the kind of pain tolerance that would make modern professional athletes weep with sympathy. But the physical demands of the game were nothing compared to the psychological pressure, because everyone involved knew that this wasn't just about athletic achievement, this was about life and death, about cosmic balance, about the favor of the gods. Here's where the Olmec ball game becomes unlike any sport that has ever existed before or since. There's strong evidence that the game could end in human sacrifice, possibly of the losing team's captain, or even the entire losing team. Let me be clear about what this means. You're not just playing for a trophy or prize money or bragging rights. You're playing for your life. If your team loses, if you fail to demonstrate sufficient skill and divine favor, you might be dragged off to an altar and sacrificed to the very gods who were supposed to be watching over the game. It was the original high-stakes competition. The Super Bowl, except the losing quarterback doesn't just get criticized on social media. He literally loses his head. The evidence for this comes from multiple sources: artistic depictions of ball players being sacrificed, archaeological remains found at ball courts that show signs of ritual killing, and the accounts of later Mesoamerican cultures who inherited the game from the Olmecs and explicitly described its sacrificial aspects. But here's what makes it even more complex and disturbing. There's also evidence that sometimes it was the winning team that was sacrificed. In some versions of the game, winning meant that you had demonstrated such exceptional skill and divine favor that you were worthy of being offered to the gods as the ultimate sacrifice. Imagine training your entire life to be the best at something, only to discover that being the best means you get to die for it. It's like the ultimate Pyrrhic victory. You win the game, but lose your life. To understand why anyone would voluntarily participate in a game with such extreme stakes, you need to understand the cosmic significance that the Olmecs attributed to the ball game. This wasn't entertainment. It was religious ritual of the highest order. The ball itself was believed to represent the sun, the moon, or other celestial bodies. The movement of the ball across the court reenacted the movement of the celestial object across the sky. The outcome of the game could influence cosmic cycles, determining whether the rains would come, whether the crops would grow, whether the balance between order and chaos would be maintained. In some versions of the mythology, the gods themselves played the ball game to determine the fate of the universe. When humans played the game, they were participating in the same cosmic struggles that kept the world functioning. The players weren't just athletes, they were representatives of divine forces channeling supernatural power through their physical performance. This belief system transformed what could have been a simple sporting competition into something much more intense and meaningful. Every move on the court had cosmic significance. Every point scored was a victory for the forces of order over chaos. Every successful play was evidence of divine favor. Given the stakes involved, it's not surprising that training for the ball game was intense beyond anything we can imagine in modern sports. Players would begin training as children, spending years developing the strength, agility, and pain tolerance necessary to compete at the highest levels. The physical training was brutal. Players had to develop the hip and thigh strength necessary to control a 9-pound ball with precision. They had to build up their pain tolerance to the point where being repeatedly struck by a rubber cannonball wouldn't disable them. They had to develop reflexes fast enough to react to a ball that could change direction unpredictably. But the mental and spiritual training was even more demanding. Players had to be prepared to face death to maintain their composure and performance level, even when they knew that failure might mean sacrifice. They had to develop the kind of religious devotion that would allow them to see their potential death as a sacred offering, rather than a tragic loss. Many players probably underwent the same kind of bloodletting rituals and spiritual preparation that we discussed earlier. They might have consumed sacred substances like chocolate to enhance their connection to the divine. They would have participated in elaborate ceremonies designed to purify their spirits and prepare them for cosmic combat. The ball game wasn't just a private ritual, it was a public spectacle that drew crowds from across the region. The courts were designed to accommodate large audiences with raised seating areas and sight lines that ensured everyone could see the action. For the spectators, these games were probably the most exciting and terrifying entertainment available. Imagine watching athletes perform at superhuman levels, knowing that some of them might not survive the experience. The emotional intensity must have been overwhelming. The excitement of athletic competition combined with the dread of potential human sacrifice. The audience wasn't just there for entertainment, though. They were participants in the ritual, their energy and attention helping to create the spiritual atmosphere necessary for the cosmic significance of the game to manifest. Their cheers and prayers were part of the religious ceremony, their collective will helping to determine which team would receive divine favor. The social implications were enormous as well. Success in the ball game could elevate a player to near divine status, while failure could mean not just death, but cosmic disgrace. Families, communities, and entire regions might have their status determined by how their representatives performed in these sacred competitions. The Olmec ball game established a template that would be followed and expanded by later Mesoamerican cultures for over 2,000 years. The Maya built larger and more elaborate ball courts, developed more complex rules, and increased the ritualistic aspects of the game. The Aztecs turned it into a centerpiece of their imperial ideology, using games as opportunities for mass human sacrifice. But the Olmecs were the ones who first established the connection between athletic competition and cosmic significance, who first argued that sports could be literally a matter of life and death. They created the original extreme sport, the prototype for all the ritual combat games that would follow. It's a legacy that's both impressive and deeply disturbing. The idea that physical competition could have spiritual significance, that athletic achievement could be a form of religious devotion, has appeared in many cultures throughout history. But few have taken it to the extremes that the Olmecs pioneered. From our modern perspective, the idea of a sport where losing means death seems barbaric and incomprehensible. We live in a world where sports are primarily about entertainment exercise and friendly competition. The idea that athletic performance could determine cosmic balance or require human sacrifice seems like primitive superstition, but it's worth considering what the Olmec ball game represented to the people who created it. This was a culture that saw all aspects of life as interconnected, where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds was permeable. In their worldview, the idea that human activities could influence cosmic forces wasn't superstition. It was observable reality. The ball game gave ordinary people the opportunity to participate in cosmic dramas to potentially achieve a form of immortality through exceptional performance or noble sacrifice. It was terrifying, but it was also meaningful in ways that modern sports rarely achieve. Whether we approve of their methods or not, the Olmecs created something unique in human history, a form of athletic competition that was simultaneously sport, religious ritual, and cosmic drama. It's a testament to the complexity and intensity of their culture, and a reminder that the line between civilization and extremism is often thinner than we'd like to believe. But as extreme as the ballgame was, it was just one aspect of a civilization that would eventually face its own ultimate game, the challenge of survival itself. And that's a game they would ultimately lose. For over 1,000 years, the Olmecs had been the dominant force in Mesoamerica. They had built massive cities, moved 50-ton stone heads across impossible terrain, developed complex religious systems involving were-jaguars and bloodletting, created the deadliest sport in human history, and basically invented half the cultural innovations that would define the region for the next 2 millennia. They were successful, they were powerful, they were the undisputed masters of their world, the civilization that everyone else looked to for inspiration and innovation. They had figured out how to thrive in one of the most challenging environments on Earth, how to organize complex societies, how to create art and architecture that would last for thousands of years. And then around 400 BCE, after more than 1,000 years of dominance, they just stopped. Not all at once. Not in a single catastrophic event that we can point to and say, that's when the Olmec civilization ended. It was more gradual, more mysterious, like a song that slowly fades out until you realize the music has stopped playing. They ghosted history. They pulled a disappearing act that makes the end of other ancient civilizations look straightforward. By comparison, the collapse of Olmec civilization wasn't sudden, but it was comprehensive. It happened in stages with different cities and regions abandoning the Olmec way of life at different times, but the overall pattern was consistent. Gradual abandonment, the cessation of monumental construction, the breakdown of trade networks, and the end of the cultural practices that had defined Olmec identity for centuries. San Lorenzo, one of the earliest and most important Olmec centers, was largely abandoned around 900 BCE. The massive earthen platforms that had supported temples and elite residences were left to the jungle. The sophisticated drainage systems that had controlled flooding were abandoned and gradually filled with sediment. The workshops that had produced jade ornaments and obsidian tools fell silent. La Venta, perhaps the most famous Olmec site, lasted longer, but eventually suffered the same fate around 400 BCE. The massive pyramid that dominated the site, the elaborate tombs filled with jade offerings, the ball courts where life and death games had been played, all of it was abandoned and left to be reclaimed by the tropical vegetation. Other sites followed similar patterns. Tres Zapotes, where Jose Melgar had found that first colossal head, managed to hang on longer than most, but even it eventually lost its distinctly Olmec character and became something else entirely. What makes the Olmec disappearance particularly mysterious is the lack of evidence for the kind of dramatic events that usually mark the end of civilizations. There are no burn layers suggesting massive fires. There's no evidence of warfare or conquest by outside groups. There are no mass graves indicating plague or other catastrophic disease outbreaks. The cities weren't destroyed, they were just gradually abandoned. People didn't die en masse, they just moved away or stopped participating in the cultural practices that made them identifiably Olmec. It's like everyone involved in the civilization simply decided to try something else. Imagine if New York City was gradually abandoned over the course of a few centuries, with no record of why people left, no evidence of war or disaster, no explanation for why one of the most successful cities in the world just slowly emptied out until only the buildings remained. That's essentially what happened to the Olmecs, except we have even less information about their motivations and decision-making processes. The archaeological record shows a clear decline in the construction of monumental architecture. The massive stone heads stopped being carved. The complex burial practices that had characterized Olmec elite culture became simpler and less elaborate. The trade networks that had brought jade from Guatemala and obsidian from central Mexico gradually collapsed. One of the most plausible explanations for the Olmec collapse involves environmental changes that made their homeland increasingly difficult to inhabit. The tropical lowlands where the Olmecs had built their civilization were never an easy place to live, but around the time of their decline, several environmental factors may have combined to make life there nearly impossible. River systems in the region are notoriously unstable, changing course, unpredictably and without warning. A river that had provided water transportation and fertile soil for centuries could suddenly decide to flow somewhere else entirely, leaving former population centers high and dry. For a civilization that depended heavily on river transport to move those massive stone monuments, the loss of navigable waterways would have been catastrophic. Climate change may have played a role as well. Paleoclimatic evidence suggests that the region experienced periods of drought during the time of Olmec decline. For an agricultural society that depended on predictable rainfall patterns, extended droughts would have meant crop failures, food shortages, and the breakdown of the economic systems that supported complex society. Volcanic activity in the region may have contributed to the environmental pressures. The Tuxtla Mountains, where the Olmecs quarried the stone for their colossal heads, are volcanic in origin, and eruptions during this period could have disrupted local climate patterns and made agriculture more difficult. Basically, Mother Nature may have decided that the Olmecs' lease was up. The environment that had supported their civilization for over 1,000 years became increasingly hostile, and eventually the costs of maintaining their complex society outweighed the benefits. Another possibility is that the Olmec collapse was driven by internal social and political pressures rather than external environmental factors. The kind of society that the Olmecs had created, with its massive construction projects, complex religious rituals, and extreme social stratification, placed enormous demands on the common people. Think about what life would have been like for an ordinary Olmec farmer or craftsman. You're expected to contribute labor for moving 50-ton stone heads across hundreds of miles of swampland. You're required to participate in religious ceremonies that involve bloodletting and possibly human sacrifice. Your rulers claim to be able to transform into jaguars and demand absolute obedience based on their supposed supernatural powers. And what do you get in return? The privilege of living in a hot, humid, disease-ridden environment where everything wants to bite you, sting you, or give you a tropical disease. Maybe the guys moving the couches finally had enough. Maybe the common people got tired of supporting an elite class that demanded incredible sacrifices while offering little in return except claims of divine authority. Maybe the social contract that held Olmec society together simply broke down under the weight of its own contradictions. This kind of internal collapse has happened to many complex societies throughout history, when the costs of maintaining social hierarchy become too high, when the benefits of civilization no longer justify the sacrifices required to sustain it. People simply walk away and try something else. The abandonment of the great Olmec centers could represent exactly this kind of popular rejection of elite authority. Instead of violent revolution, the people may have simply voted with their feet, moving away from the cities and returning to simpler, more sustainable ways of life. The most likely explanation for the Olmec collapse is probably some combination of environmental and social factors, a perfect storm of challenges that overwhelmed their ability to adapt and maintain their complex civilization. Environmental pressures like drought flooding and volcanic activity would have put stress on agricultural systems and made it harder to support large populations. These environmental challenges would have made the demands of the elite for labor, for resources, for participation in costly religious ceremonies seem increasingly unreasonable. As agricultural productivity declined and environmental challenges mounted, the trade networks that had supported Olmec civilization would have become harder to maintain. The specialized crafts and luxury goods that had been symbols of Olmec cultural achievement would have become less important when people were struggling just to grow enough food to survive. The religious system that had justified elite authority would have come under pressure as well. If the rulers claimed to control the weather and ensure good harvest through their supernatural powers, but the rains failed and the crops died. Anyway, people might have started to question whether the were-jaguar transformation thing was really working out as advertised. Social inequality that had been tolerable during good times would have become unbearable during periods of environmental stress. Why should common people sacrifice for the glory of rulers who couldn't even deliver on their basic promises of prosperity and security? What makes the Olmec collapse particularly interesting is how gradual and peaceful it seems to have been. This wasn't a violent overthrow or a sudden catastrophic collapse. It was more like a slow-motion abandonment, a gradual loss of faith in the entire Olmec way of life. People probably didn't wake up one morning and decide to abandon their cities. Instead, young people may have started choosing not to become priests or participate in elite religious ceremonies. Families may have gradually moved away from the major centers to pursue agriculture in areas that were less demanding and more sustainable. The specialized knowledge that had made Olmec civilization possible, the engineering techniques for moving massive stones, the religious practices that justified elite authority, the artistic traditions that had produced their distinctive sculptures, was probably lost gradually as fewer and fewer people chose to learn and practice these skills. It's like watching a language die. Nobody makes a conscious decision to stop speaking it, but fewer and fewer people pass it on to their children, until eventually there's nobody left who remembers how it worked. The truth is, we don't know for sure what happened to the Olmecs. We can see the evidence of their gradual disappearance. We can speculate about the environmental and social pressures that might have caused it, but we can't know for certain what was going through people's minds as they made the decisions that led to the end of their civilization. What we do know is that a civilization this powerful, this innovative, this foundational to everything that came after in Mesoamerica just stopped. They had solved the problem of living in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. They had created art and architecture that still impresses us today. They had developed religious and social systems that had sustained complex society for over 1,000 years. And none of it was enough to prevent them from fading away like smoke in the wind. It's a reminder that even the most successful civilizations are fragile, that the systems we create to organize society and make sense of the world are always temporary, always subject to forces beyond our control. The Olmecs had been the masters of their world for a millennium, and then they were gone, leaving behind only massive stone heads staring out from the jungle, and a mystery that we're still trying to solve. But here's the thing about the Olmec disappearance: they didn't really disappear. Not completely. They dissolved like sugar in water, spreading their influence throughout the region, even as their distinctive identity faded away. The people didn't vanish. They became other people. The cultural innovations didn't die. They were inherited and transformed by the civilizations that came after. The religious concepts, the artistic traditions, the technological innovations. All of it lived on, modified and adapted, but fundamentally based on Olmec foundations. In a sense, the Olmecs didn't fail. They succeeded too well. They created cultural templates that were so useful, so adaptable, that other civilizations adopted them and made them their own. The Maya calendar system, the Aztec pantheon of gods, the ball courts found throughout Mesoamerica, All of these were running on Olmec software, updated and expanded, but fundamentally based on the same core concepts. The Olmecs became the DNA of Mesoamerican civilization, invisible but essential, present in everything that came after, even though their distinctive identity had been lost to time. They were the quiet, mysterious ancestors at the head of the Mesoamerican family table, the ones whose influence shaped everything that followed, even though their own story had been forgotten. We've spent a lot of time talking about the genuine mysteries and remarkable achievements of Olmec civilization. The giant stone, heads the were-jaguar obsession, the deadly ball games, the mysterious disappearance. All of these are real aspects of Olmec culture that continue to fascinate archaeologists and puzzle researchers. But along with the legitimate mysteries, the Olmecs have also attracted their fair share of fringe theories, wild speculation, and outright nonsense. Some of these alternative interpretations have become surprisingly popular, spreading through documentaries, websites, and books that promise to reveal the truth they don't want you to know about ancient America. So before we wrap up our journey through the real Olmec world, let's take a few minutes to address some of the more persistent myths and misconceptions that have grown up around this fascinating civilization. Because while the truth about the Olmecs is plenty strange and remarkable on its own, it's important to separate genuine archaeological mystery from wishful thinking and cultural bias. Let's start with the big one, the theory that has probably generated more controversy and debate than any other aspect of Olmec. Studies the idea that the Colossal Heads represent African visitors to ancient America, and that Olmec civilization was either founded by or heavily influenced by ancient African peoples. This theory is based primarily on the facial features depicted on the stone heads. The broad noses, full lips, and distinctive facial structure have led some people to argue that these characteristics are more consistent with African physical features than with those of indigenous American populations. On the surface, this might seem like a reasonable interpretation. The heads do have distinctive features, and if you squint and use your imagination, you might be able to see some resemblance to African facial characteristics. But here's the problem. This theory has virtually zero archaeological or genetic support. Let's be clear about what we're dealing with here. The features on the heads are entirely consistent with the indigenous populations of the region, both ancient and modern. The people who live in the traditional Olmec heartland today often have the same broad facial features, the same nose, shapes the same facial proportions that we see on the colossal heads. This isn't surprising. The Olmecs were the ancestors of the people who still live in the region. They looked like Olmecs because they were Olmecs, a distinct indigenous American people who developed their own unique physical characteristics over thousands of years of adaptation to their environment. The African connection theory also ignores some pretty basic logistical problems. How exactly were ancient Africans supposed to have reached the Americas in sufficient numbers to influence an entire civilization? This was thousands of years before any known transoceanic contact between Africa and the Americas. We're talking about people who would have had to cross the Atlantic Ocean using ancient boats and navigation techniques, somehow survive the journey, and then establish enough of a presence in Central America to influence the development of an entire civilization. It's not impossible in an absolute sense, but it's so unlikely that it would require extraordinary evidence to support it, and that evidence simply doesn't exist. Here's the really problematic part of the African connection theory. It's based on the assumption that indigenous American peoples couldn't have created sophisticated art and complex civilizations on their own. The underlying logic seems to be that if the Olmecs created something impressive, they must have had help from outside. This is frankly disrespectful and historically inaccurate. Indigenous American civilizations were perfectly capable of developing sophisticated art, complex social systems, and impressive architectural achievements without any outside assistance. The idea that they needed help from ancient visitors to accomplish what they did is a form of cultural bias that diminishes their actual achievements. The Olmecs weren't remarkable because they might have been influenced by Africans. They were remarkable because they were Olmecs, a brilliant and innovative people who figured out how to build a complex civilization in one of the most challenging environments on Earth using their own ingenuity and cultural traditions. When we attribute their achievements to outside influences, we're not just getting the history wrong, we're also perpetuating the kind of thinking that has been used to justify the marginalization of indigenous peoples for centuries. Another persistent theory about the Olmecs involves the possibility that they developed the earliest writing system in the Western Hemisphere, predating Maya hieroglyphs by centuries. This theory is based primarily on a single artifact called the Cascajal block, a serpentine slab covered with 62 symbols that some researchers believe represent the earliest example of American writing. Now, this one is more complicated than the African connection theory because it's actually based on legitimate archaeological evidence. The Cascajal block is real, the symbols are intriguing, and the possibility that the Olmecs developed writing is not inherently unreasonable. Many complex civilizations have developed writing systems, and the Olmecs were certainly sophisticated enough to have done so. But here's where we need to be careful about jumping to conclusions. The evidence for Olmec writing is still hotly debated among professional archaeologists and epigraphers. While the Cascajal block is genuine and the symbols are mysterious, we're still not certain whether they represent a true writing system or something else entirely. The symbols could be a form of proto-writing, a system of notation that conveyed information without being a fully developed script, capable of recording complex language. They could be religious or ceremonial symbols that had meaning within specific contexts, but weren't used for general communication. They could even be a hoax, though most researchers who have studied the block believe it's genuine. The problem is that we only have one example, and deciphering any writing system requires multiple texts that can be compared and analyzed. With only a single artifact, it's nearly impossible to determine whether we're looking at genuine writing or something else that just looks like writing to modern eyes. What makes this particularly frustrating is that if the Olmecs did develop writing, it would be an absolutely remarkable achievement. It would mean that they were even more sophisticated than we currently believe that they had developed one of the fundamental technologies of complex civilization centuries before anyone else in the Americas. But wanting something to be true doesn't make it true. The honest answer is that we don't know whether the Olmecs had writing. The Cascajal block might represent the earliest American script, or it might be something else entirely. It's one of those archaeological mysteries where the evidence is tantalizing, but not quite sufficient to draw definitive conclusions. What we can say is that the Olmecs were clearly capable of complex symbolic communication. Their art is full of symbols and motifs that clearly had meaning within their cultural context. Whether these symbols constituted a true writing system is still an open question, one that may be answered by future archaeological discoveries. This brings up an important point about how we should approach archaeological mysteries. It's tempting to make definitive claims about the past, to say that we've solved ancient puzzles or proven controversial theories. But good archaeology is often about acknowledging uncertainty, about being honest about the limitations of our evidence. The Cascajal block is a perfect example of this. It's an important discovery that raises fascinating questions about Olmec capabilities and achievements. But until we have more evidence, more examples of similar symbol systems, more context for how these symbols were used, more information about their meaning and function, we have to resist the temptation to make claims that go beyond what the evidence actually supports. This doesn't mean we should ignore intriguing possibilities or stop speculating about what new discoveries might reveal. It just means we should be clear about the difference between evidence-based conclusions and interesting hypotheses. I probably don't need to spend much time on this one, but for the sake of completeness, let's briefly address the idea that Olmec achievements were so remarkable that they must have been the result of alien intervention or other supernatural assistance. This theory usually focuses on the logistics of moving the colossal heads, the precision of Olmec art, or the complexity of their religious systems, as evidence that ancient peoples couldn't have accomplished these things without help from advanced extraterrestrial visitors. The problem with this theory is that it dramatically underestimates human capabilities and ingenuity. Yes, moving 50-ton stone heads across hundreds of miles of challenging terrain was an incredible feat of engineering and organization, but it was also well within the capabilities of a large, well-organized society using the tools and techniques available at the time. We know how they could have done it because we understand the principles of leveraged transportation and logistics that would have been involved. We have examples of similar achievements by other ancient civilizations using comparable technologies. The idea that alien intervention was necessary to explain Olmec achievements says more about our own limitations in understanding ancient capabilities than it does about the actual impossibility of what the Olmecs accomplished. Here's the thing that supporters of fringe theories often miss: the real Olmec story is far more interesting and remarkable than any of the alternative explanations. The idea that ancient aliens helped move stone heads is nowhere near as fascinating as the reality of how the Olmecs actually organized their society to accomplish these feats using purely human ingenuity and determination. The possibility of African visitors is nowhere near as remarkable as the reality of how indigenous American peoples developed one of the world's great civilizations in one of its most challenging environments. The speculation about advanced lost technologies is nowhere near as impressive as the actual technologies and techniques that the Olmecs developed using the materials and knowledge available to them. The real mystery isn't how the Olmecs did impossible things. The real mystery is how they did extraordinary things using ordinary human capabilities pushed to their absolute limits. So why do these alternative theories continue to attract followers despite the lack of evidence to support them? Part of it is probably the natural human tendency to prefer exciting explanations over mundane ones. Ancient aliens are more thrilling than ancient engineering. Lost civilizations are more romantic than found civilizations that we can actually study and understand. But part of it is also the persistence of cultural biases that make it difficult for some people to accept that indigenous American peoples were capable of remarkable achievements. The idea that the Olmecs must have had help from outside reflects deep-seated assumptions about the capabilities of different human populations that have more to do with modern prejudices than with ancient realities. The truth is that human beings everywhere have always been capable of remarkable creativity, ingenuity, and achievement. The Olmecs weren't remarkable because they were different from other humans. They were remarkable because they were such excellent examples of what humans can accomplish when they work together toward common goals. What the persistence of these myths teaches us is the importance of basing our understanding of the past on solid archaeological evidence rather than speculation, wishful thinking, or cultural assumptions. The scientific method, the process of forming hypotheses, testing them against evidence, and revising our understanding based on what we discover, is our best tool for understanding what actually happened in the past. This doesn't mean that everything about the Olmecs has been definitively solved or that there's no room for new discoveries and revised interpretations. Archaeological understanding is always evolving as new evidence comes to light and new analytical techniques are developed. But it does mean that we should be skeptical of claims that go far beyond what the evidence actually supports, whether those claims come from professional archaeologists or amateur enthusiasts. The real story of the Olmecs, the story based on solid evidence and careful analysis, is remarkable enough. We don't need to embellish it with unlikely theories or impossible explanations to make it interesting. The truth, as they say, is strange enough. So if the Olmecs vanished around 400 BCE, if their cities were abandoned and their distinctive culture faded away, did they really disappear? The answer is both yes and no, and understanding this paradox is key to grasping the true significance of what the Olmecs accomplished. Yes, the Olmecs as a distinct civilization disappeared, their cities were abandoned, their monumental construction projects ceased, their trade networks collapsed, and the specific cultural practices that made them identifiably Olmec came to an end. But no, their influence didn't disappear. In fact, it became so fundamental to Mesoamerican civilization that it's almost invisible, like the foundation of a building that you never see, but that supports everything above it. The Olmecs didn't die, they dissolved. Their cultural DNA was absorbed into every great civilization that followed. They became the quiet, mysterious ancestors at the head of the Mesoamerican family table, the ones whose influence shaped everything that came after, even though their own story had been largely forgotten. They were the pilot episode for Mesoamerica, the proof of concept that established the basic parameters that everyone else would work within for the next 2,000 years. Let's start with religion, because this is where Olmec influence is most clearly visible in later cultures. The basic cosmological concepts that the Olmecs developed, the idea that the universe was divided into multiple layers, that certain animals had supernatural significance that rulers could access, divine power through ritual practices, became the foundation for every major Mesoamerican religious system that followed. The Maya pantheon, with its complex hierarchy of gods controlling different aspects of the natural world, was essentially a sophisticated expansion of religious concepts that the Olmecs had pioneered. The rain god Chak, one of the most important Maya deities, can be traced back directly to Olmec depictions of supernatural beings associated with water and fertility. The feathered serpent deity that would become central to Maya and Aztec religion first appeared in Olmec art, where serpents with supernatural characteristics were depicted as powerful religious symbols. The concept evolved and became more elaborate over the centuries, but the basic idea that serpents could be divine messengers or manifestations of cosmic power was an Olmec innovation. Even the were-jaguar concept that seems so uniquely Olmec continued to influence later religious systems. Maya and Aztec rulers regularly claimed to have jaguar spirit companions, and the ability to transform into jaguars remained a symbol of ultimate political and spiritual power throughout Mesoamerican history. The Aztec god, Tezcatlipoca, one of the most important deities in their pantheon, was often depicted with jaguar attributes and was believed capable of taking jaguar form. The connection to the Olmec were-jaguar tradition is unmistakable, even though it had evolved and been integrated into a much more complex religious system. The ballgame that the Olmecs invented didn't just survive their civilization, it became the defining sport of ancient Mesoamerica. Maya ball courts were larger and more elaborate than anything the Olmecs had built, with sloped walls that created even more challenging playing conditions and more opportunities for the dramatic ricochets that made the game so unpredictable. The Maya also expanded the ritual aspects of the game, creating elaborate pre-game ceremonies and developing more complex rules that could determine not just individual fate, but the outcome of wars between city-states. Maya ball courts became the settings for some of the most important political and religious dramas in their society. The Aztecs took the game to its ultimate extreme, building massive ball courts in their capital city and using games as opportunities for large-scale human sacrifice. The basic concept remained the same: teams competing with a rubber ball using only their hips and shoulders. But the scale and intensity had increased dramatically. But throughout all these later developments, you can see the Olmec DNA, the sacred nature of the courts, the life and death stakes, the belief that the game had cosmic significance. All of these were Olmec innovations that later cultures inherited and expanded. Olmec artistic innovations provided the template for Mesoamerican art for the next 2 millennia. The concept of monumental stone sculpture, the techniques for working with jade and obsidian, the symbolic vocabulary that used animal imagery to convey political and religious messages. All of these originated with the Olmecs and were passed down to later cultures. Maya stelae, those tall stone monuments covered with hieroglyphic inscriptions that commemorate important rulers and events, are direct descendants of Olmec stone monuments. The Maya made them more elaborate and added writing, but the basic concept of using carved stone to commemorate power and achievement was an Olmec innovation. The distinctive art style that archaeologists call Olmecoid appears throughout Mesoamerica during the centuries following the Olmec collapse, showing how Olmec artistic concepts were adapted and modified by different cultures in different regions. These weren't copies or imitations. They were creative reinterpretations of Olmec innovations by peoples who had inherited the basic artistic vocabulary and were using it to express their own cultural value. Even the colossal head tradition, which seemed to end with the Olmecs, influenced later monumental sculpture. While no later Mesoamerican culture created heads on the same scale as the Olmecs, the concept of using massive stone portraits to advertise political power remained central to elite ideology throughout the region. The technical innovations that the Olmecs developed didn't disappear with their civilization. They became standard practices throughout Mesoamerica. The techniques for quarrying and transporting massive stone blocks, the engineering methods for building on unstable tropical soils, the agricultural practices that made intensive farming possible in challenging environments. All of these were preserved and passed down through generations of builders and farmers. Maya architects used Olmec engineering principles to build their massive pyramid complexes. Aztec engineers employed Olmec techniques for managing water flow and preventing flood damage in their capital city. The basic technologies that the Olmecs had developed to survive and thrive in the tropical lowlands became the foundation for urban planning throughout Mesoamerica. The Olmec innovations in rubber processing also had lasting impact. While the specific techniques may have been lost, the knowledge that rubber trees could be tapped and their latex processed into useful materials spread throughout the region and eventually reached European colonizers, who would later develop these concepts into the global rubber industry. One of the most important but least visible Olmec legacies was their contribution to Mesoamerican timekeeping. The complex calendar systems that the Maya developed with their intricate combinations of ritual and solar years were built on mathematical and astronomical concepts that the Olmecs had pioneered. The long count calendar that the Maya used to track historical time over thousands of years was based on vigesimal mathematics, a base 20 number system that appears to have been an Olmec innovation. The Maya made it more sophisticated and used it for more complex calculations, but the basic mathematical principles were inherited from their Olmec predecessors. The ritual calendar that governed religious and political life throughout Mesoamerica also shows clear Olmec influence. The 260-day sacred year that was central to Maya Zapotec and Aztec religious practice appears in simplified form in Olmec art and religious symbolism, suggesting that this fundamental timekeeping concept was another Olmec contribution to regional culture. The Olmecs were among the first people in the Americas to build true cities, and the urban planning principles they developed influenced settlement patterns throughout Mesoamerica for centuries. The concept of organizing cities around central ceremonial complexes, of using monumental architecture to display political power, of integrating religious and political spaces. All of these became standard features of Mesoamerican urban design. Maya cities like Tikal and Palenque, with their massive pyramid complexes and elaborate palace compounds, were essentially sophisticated versions of urban planning concepts that the Olmecs had pioneered. The basic idea of using architecture to create sacred landscapes that reflected cosmic order was an Olmec innovation that later cultures inherited and expanded. Even the Spanish conquistadors, when they first saw Aztec cities, were looking at urban landscapes that had been shaped by planning principles that originated with the Olmecs over 2,000 years earlier. One of the most intriguing questions about Olmec influence involves language. We don't know what language the Olmecs spoke, and we may never know for certain, but some linguists have suggested that Olmec linguistic influence can be detected in later Mesoamerican languages, particularly in vocabulary related to ritual, agriculture, and political organization. The word cacao, which appears in similar forms throughout Mesoamerica and eventually entered European languages, may be of Olmec origin. If so, it would be one of the few Olmec words that survived the collapse of their civilization and spread around the world. Other technical terms related to ball games, rubber processing, and ceremonial practices also show distribution patterns that suggest they may have originated with the Olmecs and been borrowed by later cultures. But without direct evidence of the Olmec language, these connections remain speculative. What makes the Olmec legacy so remarkable is how thoroughly it was integrated into later Mesoamerican cultures. The Olmecs didn't just influence their successors, they provided the basic cultural software that made complex civilization possible in the region. When the Maya developed their sophisticated writing system, they were working within religious and political frameworks that the Olmecs had established. When the Aztecs built their empire, they were using organizational and ideological concepts that had Olmec roots. When Zapotec artists created their distinctive sculptures, they were working within an artistic tradition that the Olmecs had pioneered. It's a bit like how modern computer programming languages are all built on fundamental concepts that were established decades ago by early programmers. The specific applications keep getting more sophisticated, but the underlying principles remain the same. The Olmecs established the basic principles of Mesoamerican civilization, and everyone who came after was essentially running updated versions of their cultural operating system. In a sense, the Olmecs achieved the ultimate form of cultural success. They became so fundamental to their region's development that their specific identity became irrelevant. They didn't need to maintain political control or cultural distinctiveness because their innovations had become the foundation for everything that followed. They had solved the basic problems of complex civilization in a challenging environment so effectively that their solutions became standard practice. They had created cultural innovations so useful and adaptable that later civilizations adopted them wholesale and made them their own. The Maya, Zapotec, and Aztec civilizations weren't pale imitations of the Olmecs. They were sophisticated developments of Olmec innovations, proof that the foundational work the Olmecs had done was solid enough to support increasingly complex cultural elaborations. The Olmecs didn't fail and disappear. They succeeded so completely that they became invisible, present in everything that came after, but no longer needing to maintain their own separate existence. They had become the DNA of Mesoamerican civilization, the genetic code that would continue to shape the development of the region for another 2,000 years, even after their own distinctive culture had faded into history. So here we are at the end of our journey through the strange and fascinating world of the Olmecs. We started with a single giant stone head buried in a Mexican farmer's field, and we've ended up with were-jaguars, deadly ball games, ritual bloodletting, the world's most intense hot chocolate, and a civilization that was so successful it basically dissolved itself into the DNA of everything that came after. It's been quite a ride, hasn't it? When Jose Melgar hit that stone with his machete in 1862, he had no idea that he was uncovering evidence of the first great civilization in the Americas. He certainly didn't know that the face staring up at him from the earth had been carved by people who believed their rulers could transform into jaguars, who played sports where losing meant death, and who moved 50-ton blocks of stone across impossible terrain using nothing but human ingenuity and probably an alarming amount of cursing in languages that are now extinct. But that's exactly what he'd found. A window into a world that was simultaneously more sophisticated and more terrifying than anything he could have imagined. The Olmecs weren't just ancient people who carved big heads. They were brilliant engineers who figured out logistics problems that would challenge modern construction companies. They were devout believers who were willing to endure incredible pain to maintain their relationship with the divine. They were ruthless competitors who turned athletic achievement into a matter of life and death. They were master artists who created works of beauty and psychological complexity that still impact viewers today. In other words, they were human beings, complicated, contradictory, capable of both remarkable creativity and disturbing extremism. They were people trying to make sense of a chaotic world, using the best tools and knowledge available to them, just like we are today. The takeaway here isn't that the Olmecs were primitive or barbaric or uniquely violent. The takeaway is that human beings have always been capable of extraordinary achievements and disturbing practices, often at the same time. The capacity for both brilliance and brutality, for both innovation and extremism, seems to be part of the basic human package. The Olmecs just happened to live in a time and place where both tendencies could be expressed without the constraints that modern civilization places on human behavior. They were people without safety nets, without scientific explanations for natural phenomena, without the accumulated knowledge of thousands of years of human cultural development. And yet they created something remarkable. They built a civilization that lasted for over 1,000 years in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. They developed technologies and cultural innovations that provided the foundation for everything that came after in their region. They solved problems that should have been impossible to solve with the tools available to them. From our comfortable modern perspective, with our climate-controlled homes and reliable food supplies and sports that don't end in human sacrifice, it's easy to look at the Olmecs and feel superior. We don't practice ritual bloodletting or believe our leaders can transform into jaguars or move massive stones across swampland for no apparent reason other than to show off. But maybe we should be a little more humble about our own accomplishments. The Olmecs built a sustainable civilization that lasted for over a millennium, using only renewable resources and human labor. Can we say the same about our own society? They created art and architecture that has survived for thousands of years. How much of what we build today will still be standing in the year 5000? They developed religious and social systems that provided meaning and purpose for thousands of people over dozens of generations. They created communities where people were willing to make incredible sacrifices for the common good, where individuals would endure pain and hardship to maintain the cosmic balance that they believed kept their world functioning. Sure, some of their practices seem extreme to us, but they also demonstrate a level of commitment to community welfare and cosmic responsibility that we might actually learn from. When was the last time you were willing to bleed for your beliefs? When did you last participate in a community effort that required real sacrifice for the common good? I'm not suggesting that we should bring back ritual bloodletting or human sacrifice, but maybe we could learn something from the Olmec understanding that maintaining civilization requires ongoing effort and sacrifice, that the benefits of complex society don't come for free. Maybe the real lesson of the Olmec story is appreciation. Appreciation for the complexity of human cultural achievement, for the ingenuity that our species has always demonstrated when faced with impossible challenges, for the fact that we live in a time when our biggest worry is usually whether our Wi-Fi is working, rather than whether our ruler can successfully transform into a jaguar to prevent the crops from failing. Think about your morning routine. You wake up in a climate-controlled environment, flip a switch to get light, turn a handle to get clean water, open a device to access the accumulated knowledge of human civilization, and consume food that was grown thousands of miles away and transported to your location through networks of incredible complexity. All of this is possible because of thousands of years of human innovation and cultural development, building on foundations that were laid by people like the Olmecs, who figured out the basic principles of complex civilization in challenging environments using primitive tools and incredible determination. Your morning coffee is possible because people thousands of years ago figured out agriculture, trade networks, and social organization. Your smartphone works because of mathematical and scientific principles that were first developed by ancient peoples who were trying to understand the movements of celestial bodies and the patterns of natural phenomena. The Olmecs were part of that great human project of figuring out how to live together in complex societies, how to organize large groups of people to accomplish goals that no individual could achieve alone, how to create meaning and purpose in the face of an often hostile and unpredictable universe. The Olmec story also reminds us how much we don't know about the past, how many mysteries remain unsolved, despite decades of archaeological research and analysis. We can see the evidence of their achievements, We can speculate about their motivations and beliefs, but there's still so much that we can't know for certain. Why did they move those massive heads? What did they really believe about the relationship between humans and jaguars? How did their political systems actually function? What happened during those final centuries when their civilization was gradually dissolving? What did they call themselves, and how did they understand their place in the cosmos? These are the kinds of questions that keep archaeologists awake at night, the puzzles that drive researchers to spend their careers digging through tropical mud and carefully cataloging broken pottery fragments. The hope that somewhere in the archaeological record are the clues that will help us understand not just what the Olmecs did, but why they did it and what it meant to them. But here's the thing that makes the Olmec story particularly fascinating. It's not really over. Every year brings new archaeological discoveries, new analytical techniques, new ways of understanding the evidence that previous generations of researchers have uncovered. DNA analysis is beginning to reveal information about Olmec population movements and relationships with other ancient peoples. Remote sensing technology is discovering new sites and features that traditional excavation methods might have missed. Advances in dating techniques are providing more precise chronologies for Olmec development and decline. The Cascajal block that we discussed earlier might eventually be joined by other examples of Olmec symbol systems, potentially answering the question of whether they developed writing. New discoveries might reveal more about their agricultural practices, their social organization, their trade relationships with other ancient peoples. The story of the Olmecs is still being written, still being uncovered one artifact at a time by researchers who share Jose Melgar's sense of wonder at finding evidence of remarkable human achievements buried in unlikely places. So what's the bottom line? What should you remember from our long journey through the humid, jaguar-haunted world of ancient Mesoamerica? Maybe it's that human beings have always been capable of remarkable things when they work together toward common goals, even with primitive tools and limited knowledge. Maybe it's that the foundations of our modern world were laid by people who faced challenges we can barely imagine and found ways to overcome them. Maybe it's that the past is both stranger and more relevant than we usually realize. Or maybe it's simply that there are giant stone heads buried in the Mexican jungle carved by people who believed their rulers could transform into jaguars. And that's just one of the many wonderful and terrifying things that humans have accomplished over the course of our long and complicated history. The Olmecs remind us that civilization is both more fragile and more resilient than we think. Fragile because even the most successful societies can disappear, their cities abandoned and their names forgotten. Resilient because the innovations and achievements of those lost civilizations can survive and continue to influence the world thousands of years later. They remind us that every human society is an experiment, an attempt to figure out how to live together and make meaning in an uncertain world. Some experiments last longer than others, but all of them contribute something to the great human project of understanding ourselves and our place in the universe. And they remind us that the next time you're enjoying a piece of chocolate, you're participating in a tradition that was started by people who moved 50-ton stones through swampland and believed that their drinks could facilitate communication with shape-shifting jaguar gods. Which, when you think about it, makes that chocolate taste a little more interesting, doesn't it? Alright everyone, that's our journey through the mysterious world of the Olmecs. Thanks for hanging out with me and diving into the weird and wonderful past, for following the story from a farmer's discovery in 1862 to the cosmic ball games and were-jaguar transformations of ancient Mesoamerica. If this kind of deep dive into forgotten civilizations is your thing, you know what to do. There are so many more stories out there, so many more lost worlds to explore, so many more reminders that the past was far stranger and more fascinating than anything Hollywood could dream up. Until next time, stay curious, appreciate your air conditioning and your bloodless sports, and remember that you're living in the continuing story of human civilization that began with people like the Olmecs, who were brave enough to try impossible things in impossible places. Sleep well, and thanks for joining me in the land of the were-jaguars.